Good day and welcome to Herstory, episode 21, I believe. The Halloween edition. I denied so much about who to do for Halloween. I thought about doing Eileen Warnos, who it's a controversial thing to say, but is my favourite serial killer. And I say that not in the sense of like, oh, she's my favourite because of the things she did. My favourite in the sense of the things that happened to her in her life, kind of, you can see how she could have possibly snapped, and I think she's a really tragic figure and a really interesting figure. So I will do Eileen Warnos at some point, but I don't necessarily think she's a Halloween figure. I don't think she's evil. I think she's mentally ill. So the topic of today's discussion, however, Delphine LaLaurie, is most definitely evil. So I got some glare going on here. So I'm gonna talk to you today about Delphine LaLaurie. I can't actually see without my glasses, so this is going to be interesting. Please just try and ignore the glare. Not quite sure what I'm going to do here. Shift. I'm going to sort the lighting switch out and then come back. Slightly better, hopefully. Slightly better. Not that much better, but there's not a great deal I can do in the terrible lighting in this room, so hopefully I'm going to get me some camera bits and editing bits for Christmas. So we're going to take Herstory to a whole new level. However, my prop for today, Edgar's Raven, has been lost, so I'm gonna sod it. Sorry, Edgar. It's gonna go right there. Anyway, let's, without further ado, get on to Delphine LaLaurie, New Orleans socialite, serial killer, murderess, and torturer of slaves, and a thoroughly all-round pleasant individual. Born Marie Delphine McCarty on the 19th of March 1787 in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was one of 5 children. Her father, Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, and mother, Marie-Jeanne L'Arable, were both prominent in the town's European Creole community. Her uncle, Esteban, I never know how to say that. Is it Esteban? It's Stephen, isn't it? He was the governor of Louisiana and Florida from 1785 to 1791, and her cousin, Augustine, was the mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820, so quite an influential family in New Orleans. On June the 11th, 1800, aged just 13, Marie married Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a Cabelan. Wow, a Cabelan, a high-ranking Spanish royal officer. What a name! Don Ramon de Lopez y Angelo. And they married at St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. Louisiana at the time was a Spanish territory, and then it becomes a British territory, and it's back and forth between the Spanish and the British at this point since the 1760s. So in 1804, the Americans acquired what was a French territory, and that's why it has that kind of rich sort of French language behind it, and very, very complex ethnographic history. So he dies in Havana, leaving Delphine a widow with a baby girl called Marie Borgia. And in June 1808, aged 21, Delphine marries Jean Blanc, a prominent banker and plantation owner, merchant, lawyer, legislator, and slave trader. Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street in New Orleans for the family, which later became known as Villa Blanc. They had 4 children together: Marie, Louise, Marie, and Jean. Just to confuse things, you've got, the first child was called Marie as well, so you've got 3 Maries, a Louise and a Jean. Blanc died in 1816, leaving Delphine a shed load of cash, as well as his plantation and all of his slaves. On the 25th of June, 1825, Delphine married her 3rd husband, physician Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, who was much younger than her. In 1831, she bought a property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with very little involvement from her husband, and it is this house that is going to become absolutely notorious in the story of Delphine LaLaurie. In 1832, she had a 2-story mansion built there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with her husband and 2 of her daughters and maintained a central position in New Orleans society. She was quite the socialite. The family maintained several black slaves in slave quarters attached to the Royal Street mansion. Accounts of Delphine's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834 vary. Harriet Martineau, who recounted tales told to her by New Orleans residents during a visit, claims Delphine's slaves were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched looking. However, in public appearances, Delphine was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of her slaves' health. She looked as if she cared in public. Court records of the time showed Delphine manumitted or freed 2 of her slaves, Jean-Louise in 1819 and Devance in 1832. Martineau wrote that public rumours about Delphine's mistreatment of her slaves were sufficiently widespread that a local lawyer was dispatched to the Royal Street property to remind Delphine of the laws for the upkeep of slaves and their treatment. However, during the visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of the slaves by Delphine, so he left and just gave her a bit of a warning. Martineau also recounted other tales of Delphine's cruelty that were current among New Orleans residents in 1836. Now, there is a significant event that happens in 1834, and it blows the lid on the whole thing. So, although 1836 is a contemporary account, it is written after the discovery of what Delphine's been doing to her slaves. So we have to take it with a little pinch of salt, and I will go into Martineau's account later, but I think it's important to understand the events of April 10th, 1834, and then you can understand why this comes as a result afterwards. So on April 10th, 1834, a fire broke out at the LaLaurie residence on Royal Street, starting in the kitchen. When the police and fire marshals arrived, they found a 70-year-old cook chained to the stove by her ankle. She later said that she had set the fire herself on purpose as a suicide attempt because she was afraid of being punished by Delphine, and that slaves who were taken to the uppermost room for punishment never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee on April the 11th, the following day, 1834, bystanders attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that they had all been evacuated, but Delphine refused to hand over the keys. The bystanders broke down the doors and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs stretched and torn from one extremity to the other." End quote. They claimed to have been imprisoned there for months. Judge Jean-Francois Canon, one of the people who entered the premises, reported having found inside the LaLaurie mansion a negress wearing an iron collar and an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, who was too weak to be able to walk. He added that the slaves were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static position. He's quoted as saying, "An appalling sight, their bodies covered with scars and loaded with chains." Quite chilling stuff. When the discovery of the abused slaves became known, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street property and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained such damage that scarcely anything remained but the walls. The slaves were taken to the local jail, where it was reported up to 4,000 people attended to view the slaves to convince themselves of their suffering. So high was Delphine's standing in the New Orleans community that people actually had to see this for themselves. And not were these slaves treated with compassion? Were they looked after? No, they were put on show like a circus. Awful. The Pittsfield Sun cited that 2 slaves had died since the evacuation and quoted, "We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found." Delphine had owned at least 54 slaves between 1816 and 1834, and only 26 of those, so roughly half, came from the plantation that her second husband had left her. Delphine's life after the fire is not well documented at all. She seems to vanish off the face of the earth. It's thought she fled New Orleans during the mob violence following the fire, took a coach to the waterfront and travelled by schooner, never know how to say that, to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. So, in comes Martineau in 1836. So, in light of that having been uncovered, this is Martineau's contemporary account. So, when she visited the mansion in 1836, it was unoccupied and badly damaged with gaping windows and empty walls. It was during this visit that Martineau hears the rumours that we touched on briefly earlier. Apparently, after the lawyer's visit, one of Delphine's neighbours saw one of their slaves, a 12-year-old girl called Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding Delphine. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a tangle, causing Delphine to grab her whip and chase her. The body was subsequently buried in the grounds. This was the child that they found in the well. Apparently, Delphine also beat her daughters when they attempted to free or help any of the slaves or showed them any kindness. The circumstances of Delphine's death are just as unclear as what happened to her when she fled New Orleans. George Cable recounted in 1888 an unsubstantiated but popular theory that she died in France in a boar hunting accident. In the late 1930s, Eugene Bax, sexton to the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans, discovered an old cracked copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery that was inscribed in French, "Madame LaLaurie, born Madame Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris, December 7th, 1842. However, according to the French archives in Paris, she died on December the 7th, 1849, at the age of 62. Her death was recorded by her son-in-law. In reality, we have no idea. She vanished after the fire, seemingly without trace, and to this day, her body has never been found. Did she return to New Orleans, or did she die in Paris? No one knows. So, fun facts, if you can call them fun facts, about Delphine LaLaurie. The New Orleans house occupied by the LaLauries did not survive the fire and the mob damage. It remained in a ruined state until 1838, when Pierre Trasteur rebuilt it. Over the following decades, it was used as a public school, a conservatory of music, an apartment building, a refuge for young delinquents, a bar, a furniture store, and more. The dwelling had a 3rd floor added and a rear building on Governor Nichols Street in the later 19th century. This rear building was remodelled and had another 2 stories added in the 1920s. In April 2007, actor Nicolas Cage bought the mansion for $3.4 million. On November 13th, 2009, the property was listed for auction as a result of bank foreclosure and was purchased by the Regions Financial Corporation for $2.3 million. Whilst the majority of all New Orleans tours stop outside 1140 Royal Street, you cannot go inside at this time as the mansion is privately owned by a Texan oil tycoon. What does one buy when they have everything, eh? Jean de Levine wrote in 1946 in Ghost Stories of New Orleans that Delphine had a sadistic appetite that seemed never appeased until she had afflicted one or more of her black servitors, some hideous form of torture, and claimed that those who responded to the 1834 fire had found male slaves stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled out by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in skulls where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. Now, de Levine did not cite any sources for these claims, and these are not supported by primary sources, so methinks perhaps there's a little bit of storytelling going on there. Nonetheless, what happened there was atrocious, but over the years, this story has grown and grown and grown and gained legs and eyes and ears and all kinds of extras. So the story is further embellished by Kalila Katarina Smith in her 1998 Journey into Darkness, Ghosts and Vampires of New Orleans, who added more explicit details supposedly discovered by the helpers during the fire, probably to spice up the story told by her New Orleans ghost tour. Maybe. Probably. Of a victim who obviously had her arms amputated and her skin peeled off in a circular pattern, making her look like a human caterpillar. Another who had her limbs broken and reset at odd angles so she resembled a human crab. Again, unsourced and not supported by primary accounts. There's another story of somebody having excrement put in their mouth and then having it sewn shut. Another story of somebody else being coated in honey and left to be eaten by insects. As I say, the story's just grown and grown and grown over the years. Today, modern retellings of the LaLaurie legend often use the latter two versions of the tale as the basis for claims of sadistic torture and place the number of slaves who died at up to 100. We only have evidence of 4 who died, the 2 buried in the garden and the 2 who died after the evacuation. More facts. This is a fact. The 70-year-old cook was chained to the stove, and in the attic 7 slaves were mutilated and tied with spiked iron collars. All of them were naked. 2 bodies were later dug up in the grounds, one of a child thought to be Leah. So that's the truth. That's the facts. Martineau was only there 2 years later, so although slightly sensationalized in light of what was discovered during the fire, I'm more inclined to believe her accounts of the rumours that were on the street at the time in New Orleans than these accounts that were written in 1946 and 1988. There is a story that after the incident with Leah, an investigation took place and Delphine was forfeited 9 of her slaves as a fine for her misconduct. These slaves were then immediately purchased by one of Delphine's relatives and returned to her in the LaLaurie household, which, if true, is absolutely horrendous. There's also been rumours that her doctor husband used to perform voodoo medicine on them and experiment on them. There's also rumours that when causing chaos. Rumours that when the house was rebuilt, skeletons of slaves were found in the walls. And there's also rumours that slaves were experimented on medically, as I've said before. Not necessarily. There's the medical thing, and then there's the voodoo thing as well. There's no contemporary basis for these as facts. There is no doubt that Delphine treated her slaves horrifically and barbarically as nothing more than objects and cattle, and her mistreatment was clearly bad enough to revile the New Orleans citizens into the mob violence that followed the fire. So there is absolutely no disputing that what she did was awful. Why? I've really looked into the why of this. What caused her to be this way, and I can't find a lot. Delphine's male relatives, including her father, were supposed to have had slave mistresses. One of her uncles was murdered by one of his slaves in the 1811 slave revolts, but then she was like 20 then, so I don't know. Was she just a horrendous racist? Was she a sadist? Did she have the opinion she could get away with whatever she wanted as a high-flying member of the New Orleans social scene? It was common for masters at the time to physically discipline their slaves, but there were strict guidelines in place to prevent and discourage excessive physical cruelty. Clearly she didn't think these rules applied to her, despite the several investigations into her behaviour. It's a travesty that she never faced any kind of recrimination or punishment for the brutality she doled out, and either made it to Paris. Her daughters received and denied ever receiving any word from her after her disappearance, so they didn't say one way or the other whether she stayed in Paris or she came back to New Orleans and lived under an assumed identity. We just don't know. The last recorded sighting of her was by the poet William Cullen Bryant, who puts her on a ship named the Poland, sailing from New York to Le Havre in 1834, immediately after the fire. So, actress Kathy Bates depicted a fictionalized version of Delphine in the 3rd season of American Horror Story Coven. This tale again grows legs, and she slathers the blood of her victims on her face to maintain a youthful complexion. So it seems that every time this story is retold, there is another layer of brutality and gruesomeness added to it. Her husband, when confronted about the treatment of their slaves, said some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. So if not complicit in what Delphine was doing, he was clearly turning a blind eye to it and didn't really care very much. Jules Vin, an eccentric wealthy recluse who bought and lived in the house secretly until he passed away in 1892, where his body was found by authorities on a tattered cot in the mansion, apparently living in filth with bags full of money and antiques stashed throughout the residence, just to make things a little bit weirder. When the house was converted into an apartment complex, residents complained of violent and terrifying ghostly encounters. One alleged that the ghost of a naked chained slave chased after them before vanishing into thin air. Tenants never stayed long, and eventually they sold up and the apartments were made into business offices. Businesses moved in, but none of them lasted very long. In the late 70s, when the house was again turned into an apartment building during renovations, the owners apparently discovered bodies that had been hastily thrown into a mass grave beneath the house. I can't find any supporting evidence for this, but if you can, please leave it in the comments below. The current owner does not live there, this Texan oil tycoon. After 3 months, he evacuated the place after supposedly hearing shrieks and moans. Today, Delphine LaLaurie is nicknamed the Widow Blanche. The Savage Mistress of New Orleans, and The Demon in the Shape of a Woman. If you would like to read more about Delphine LaLaurie and her despicable antics at 1140 Royal Street, New Orleans, you can look at Carolyn Marrow Long's Mistress of the Haunted House. You can look at Victoria Cosner Love and Laura Lee Shannon's Mad Madame LaLaurie, New Orleans' most famous murderess. So there we go, Delphine LaLaurie, suitably horrific for Halloween, I think. Was she mad? Was she bad? No one knows. I can't seem to find a reason why she did it. There doesn't seem to be any deep-seated reason for why she would behave this way. But then I suppose I always like to look at the psychology behind people like that and why they do things like that. And sometimes there is just no explanation, is there? Some people are just evil. I think Delphine LaLaurie was one of those evil people. So there we go. That is Delphine LaLaurie. Next week we are back with a slightly more cheery topic. You've all been on the Facebook page and voting, and Jackie O won the battle for JFK. It was Marilyn Monroe versus Jackie O. So Jackie O is our subject for next week. So I look forward to seeing you then for episode 22. Get over onto the Facebook page, have a vote on the poll. The Herstory Girls is the name of the page. Have a little vote on the poll and see who you would like to see after Jackie O. Please give us a like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you think of Delphine LaLaurie and her despicable tales, and if anyone can find any evidence for any of the claims that are made here, please do drop them down below. And I also tried to find out what happened to Delphine LaLaurie's husband after the fire, but I couldn't find anything on that either. So if you can find that out, please do let me know below. And yeah, that's it. Have a happy Halloween, whatever you're doing. If you're going out trick-or-treating, if you're going to a party, or like me, if you're gonna stay in and probably turn all the lights off and pretend you're not at home because you're antisocial. Just let me know. I will be trying to recover. You might have noticed, you may not have noticed, that my face is extremely lopsided at the moment because I have a dental abscess. So I'm on very strong antibiotics, very strong painkillers, and I'm going to be holed up trying to recover and writing my final master's essay at the same time. So fun times. Never rains but it pours. Anyhow, I'm going to let you go, and I will see you next week with Jackie O. Mwah!